Hi, everybody. Today we have another episode in our interviews on Indie Cafe 2. And today we have a special guest, one of the most famous rock and roll photographers, Gered Mankowitz, who I've been a big fan of for years, being an album cover designer for years. And he's done some iconic work. Before we get to Gered, I want to make an announcement. My partner, Judith Salovitz, and myself are honored to be in a big Lou Reed NYPL show at Lincoln Center. It's really like an Lou Reed archival show, and it'll be on at Lincoln Center till March 2023. We have our designed New York album, Magic and Loss album, and the Velvet Underground '93 tour album, and we designed those albums with Sylvia Reed. So I wanted to make that note, and now we'll get right into the interview. Hi, Gered. We're very happy to have you on our show, and you've done some incredible stuff. I mean, some of the covers have been just some of them. December's Children, Between the Buttons album cover, Out of Our Heads album, and also 45s, two 45s that are in. Judith and I have two major 45 books called 45 RPM and 545s. Two of your 45 covers are in there, Out of Our Heads, and also Let's Spend the Night Together with the back of Ruby Tuesday, very famous single, by the way. So anyway, let's start in. I'd like to start in by asking you, and then we're going to get into your book, very famous book that was out years ago called Satisfaction, the Rolling Stones 1965 to 1967, photos of Gered Mankowitz. It was published in 1984 by St. Martin's Press, a book that I have, and we'll go through that. But before we even get into the book, I want to ask you how you started. What got you into rock photography, for instance?
Well, I started when I was 15, but actually what inspired me to be a photographer was the great comedy actor Peter Sellers.
Oh.
Peter was an acquaintance of my father's. They worked together on several movies, and my father was a screenwriter and a producer. And one day when I was about 11 or 12, Peter came to our house for Sunday lunch, and he was an incredibly enthusiastic amateur photographer. And he brought with him a big 5x4 Polaroid camera, which back in 57, 58 was a pretty unique and novel thing. We hadn't seen a lot of Polaroids in the UK by that time, and so that was special. But he also bought a complete 500C kit, a Hasselblad 500C kit.
Wow.
And he took some magical photographs of me apparently holding my brother Jonathan in the palm of my hand, like Tom Thumb.
Yeah.
And we were just absolutely knocked out by that, the magic of it, and seeing how he did it, and then seeing the photograph materialize after 2 minutes or something. That was fantastic. But then he explained the workings, the intricate workings of the Hasselblad, but he did it in an insane goon show Swedish chef type voice. And I was just weeping with laughter and loving the Hasselblad and just being knocked out by this. And when Peter left, I said to my dad, I think I want to be a photographer, and I'd like to have a Hasselblad. And that was really what inspired me.
Oh.
I just thought it just seemed like photography was funny and full of happiness and joy and laughter.
That's a great story. I always loved the Hasselblad camera. I liked the way it looked, what it did, in portraiture. It had a great lens size, I guess, negative size, right?
Yes.
Gerard? Yeah. And it was great for reproduction, obviously, because of the size of the negative you're working with. Let's get to your book, the book that I'm very fascinated with, that I have in my collection, Satisfaction. I love this book because it's, first of all, it's the early, very early Rolling Stones. It's inside out of them. You have all kinds of areas of the Stones. You have them on stage, live shots. You have them backstage. You have them informally. You have them in the studio, all different ways. And I love the pictures. The pictures are phenomenal, by the way. But let's start off in the book structure. In the beginning of the book, you mentioned April 1965, the first time you shot the Stones. What was that like?
Well, it was amazing. I mean, you know, the Stones, they hadn't had the single Satisfaction yet. They hadn't had the global success or the major success in America that Satisfaction would bring them. But they were well established in England, in the UK, and in Europe. And I was already a bit of a fan of the Stones, because although we all loved the Beatles, the Stones for me were extra special. They were naughty, you know, they broke the rules, and they were cheeky, they were disrespectful, they rocked the boat, they just weren't the clean-cut mop heads that the Beatles were. The Beatles' music was great, and I love the Beatles' music from the first single, but their image was very clean. And you know, your granny liked the Beatles, and that was a good reason to find somebody else.
That's
and
true.
The Stones were it for me. And so meeting them, and I must explain, I knew Brian Jones a little bit socially. I'd met him in '64. I'd been working with Marianne Faithfull a lot, so I got to know Andrew Loog Oldham, who was the manager of the Stones. And it was through me working with Marianne that Andrew asked me to work with the Stones. And when I went up to the office to meet the Stones, they were really charming and friendly and welcoming and warm. And you must understand that I was 18, no, maybe even younger. Maybe I was only 17. And I mean, they were all a couple of years older than me. And at that point in time, you know, when you're a teenager, if somebody is in their 20s or 21, that's old, that's getting on. And, you know, so I was a kid and I really didn't know any different. And they were just so sweet to me. I mean,
that's nice.
I don't have any recollection of any sort of negativity or unfriendliness at all. They were welcoming. And then we did our first session, as I say in the book, in April '65. I don't have the job book for that period anymore. That was lost years ago. But I reckon it was April '65.
Yeah.
You might be interested to know about Satisfaction was actually not my first book. It wasn't even my first Stones book, because I did this book, and I don't know whether you're going to be able to see this, but I did this book, which was called Stoned. And this was a Rolling Stones songbook. So it was it was sheet music.
Oh, wow. That's great.
And the music, the people who published this, a company called Music Sales, asked the designer, Pierce Marchbank, to put it together. And Pierce, who was a friend of mine and knew my Stones photograph, suggested that we did a sort of portfolio of pictures in the book. And so this is just a double page spread.
Oh, wow. That's great.
And this book was the forerunner, and if you like, the prototype for Satisfaction.
Right. Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
I love the shots there. You also, I noticed in the book, let's start off with the band. Yeah, the live shots on the stage where the audience is hysterical. It's like you can see they're really going crazy out there in front of the Stones. I love those shots. You have shots of the now. Tell us about the fans rushing the stage.
Oh well, the the promoters of music concerts at this time, 65, we're talking about the fall of 65, October, November, December. That was when the tour was happening. And in those days, the promoters really were quite inexperienced. I mean, some of them, particularly in some of the Midwest and Southern states, had really never put on a rock and roll concert before.
Wow.
And they didn't know how to deal with it. And the security was extremely casual. And everybody thought that their sons and daughters were going to stay in their seats and, clap politely at the end of each song. And that it would be, like a Pat Boone concert, or maybe that's not a good example. But of course, the Stones, that they were a wild band, and this is at this point in time, they were these wild men of rock and roll, and they were sexy, and the kids, both the boys and the girls, for that matter, were getting pretty worked up. And Mick Jagger was an absolute master, even in those early days, at manipulating the audience and getting the audience worked up. And they were just screaming and jumping up from their seats and dancing in the aisles and rushing the stage. And nobody was prepared for this. I mean, the band knew that was going to happen. And the band would tell the promoter and the security people, you're going to have to be prepared for this. But of course they weren't, and they thought that they could handle it, and most of them couldn't. And so nearly every show was stopped at some point. And in those days, the Stones only did a full show, was probably only about 40 minutes, if that. And if they got 15 or 20 minutes before the show was stopped, that was considered to be a pretty good. So, and often, I mean, I tried to record it, but the lighting was so bad, and I didn't use flash. The police chief would come on, the fire chief would come on, and if we were in a theater, they'd bring down that fire curtain thing, and the band were often furious because they felt that they could cope with it. So yes, it was chaos, but it was fun, and it was exciting, and being on stage with the band at that point in time was an extraordinary experience.
Which brings me up to my next point, where you mentioned how Mick used tambourines and maracas and drove the girls crazy in the audience. I love that.
Well, he was good tambourine and maraca player, and he was a good harmonica player, and I mean, he used the instruments in a provocative way, and he wiggled his bum, he wiggled his butt at the audience. And that, in those days, there weren't that many performers, particularly skinny white guys from London, shaking their booty at the audience, and that together with the sexy maracas and the tambourine was driving audiences wild.
Well, it's interesting you're bringing up, and I just thought about that. It's almost like Elvis Presley when he started, was shaking his body, and how the people went crazy, and drove them nuts.
I mean, Mick had this extraordinary sort of vaguely James Brown sort of dance style, which he sort of picked up from various different places, and it was very sort of jerky and uncontrolled, but of course it was very, very controlled. I mean, he just had a way to him. he was a master. I mean, even in those early days, he was a real master of working the audience to a frenzy and controlling them. And of course, what would happen, the show would be closed down, stopped. The police chief would come and say, you've got to go and you sit in your seats, you've got to sit down, you've got to be nice boys and girls. And then he'd say, and then I can start the show, and they'd sit down, and then the curtain would go back up and the band would start playing, and Mick would come to the front, he'd go, get out of your seats,
Yeah.
Start again. It was pretty chaotic.
Yeah, you have some really great backstage shots in the book. I want to point out some great also shots on the airplane traveling, which I like a lot. In fact, Mick took a shot of you turning around in your chair. I noticed that it's a shot of you.
Yeah, he asked me to, he said, pass me your camera and I'll take a picture of you. There were very, very few pictures of me back in those days, and it was just two chaps having a laugh. But it's a nice little picture, and I've always liked it, and I look like a baby in it. But yeah, the thing is that I wasn't an experienced reportage photojournalist, and I really didn't know what my responsibility was, and we didn't have a reason, really. We didn't have a reason for me to be on the tour, because my work, I wasn't going to be able to turn my work round in a way that the American press could use. And the English press weren't really interested in a tour that was happening thousands of miles away in America. And so I didn't really understand what my purpose was. And I didn't have the editorial experience that would have helped me put together a story. So I just photographed things as I saw them. And so when I worked on the stage with the band, because generally the lighting was so awful, I did a lot of work from behind the band, shooting into the spotlights, because I felt that the atmosphere was really exciting. And I wasn't worried about movement, because they were a band who moved a lot. And so I thought that the blur would add to the atmosphere. So I wasn't really too bothered about that. But I regret not being a better photojournalist, because I would have taken more pictures. I think I would have done a better job. Having said that, I think I did what I did. I think I did pretty well, and I'm very pleased with that. But I just always regretted not being a more experienced photographer. I think I would have.
Yeah.
And funny enough, quite recently, Andrew Lou Golden, who managed the band in those days, he said to me that actually the only reason I was on the tour was because he wanted to make the band feel good about themselves, feel positive.
Oh, wow.
Successful.
Nice. Yeah.
And the Beatles had taken a photographer just earlier that year. So at the beginning of 65 or late 64, the Beatles had taken a photographer on tour with them. And so this was sort of an act really just to flatter the band.
Oh, wow.
I did that. Of course, I had no idea about that at the time.
Sure. The next part of the book is there's several. Next one we're going to talk about. One is called Mason's Yards, London, 1965, a building site. You shot them, some great shots there on the roof. Apparently, it was across from your studio, I believe. And then you described what I thought was interesting, the clothing style they had. Describe that, about their clothing style.
Well, in these pretty early days, they were very much five individuals. That had already been defined. They'd gone through a period in 63 and early 64 when they had a sort of uniform look like every other band, but they'd rejected that very quickly. And they were established as five individuals who had a look that perhaps was current, but wasn't remotely the same. So Mick and Keith still looked quite studenty, quite youthful, Brian Jones probably had the most refined and charismatic sort of rock and roll look at that moment in time.
Yeah.
Bill Wyman was always quite unique and rather old-fashioned in his style. And Charlie Watts, who in many ways was the most stylish Rolling Stone, he always had this in fantastically hip sort of New York jazz look to him. He loved jazz, he loved New York, and he had this very stylish look. He always wore a tie, always wore a shirt and tie and a jacket. And between them, this sort of rather disparate look just gave you a feeling of a group of young men who were you wanted to be part of this look.
Yeah.
It was an interesting and an intriguing look, but it was pretty unformed still in early '65.
In that location, there's a cage where apparently they moved bricks or something for the building, and you did a shot with them with the cage. I thought that was a great shot you took of them.
Thank you. That was a brick. It was a cage, as you say. It was a cage used to transport bricks from that point where the bricks were all stacked up over onto the site. And a couple of weeks earlier, a major British newspaper had labeled the band as being nothing better than animals who should be caged up. And so I thought this was an appropriate moment.
And perfect.
And so we stuck them in the cage. And
I love that. That's a great story. Now we're going to go into a very famous shot out of our heads for the 45, and I believe it's used for a cover. I love the way you did that. That's not a normal group shot in equally, they're set up. There's once Brian's sitting down, the group is in the background. You have walls to the left and right of them. Describe that one, the location, how you did that.
So I think we're talking about, if you're talking about the black and white cover.
Yes, black and white.
Black and white. So that was December's Children in America and Out of Our Heads in England. And that was taken during the first 1965 photo session. Mm-hmm. And that was their hoardings. So that you see the band through these two shapes, and they're hoardings that were used to block off the building site at night. And they were just leaning against a wall, and I saw this deep triangular shape, and I thought it would make a cover. I didn't know it was going to be a cover. I just thought it would make a cover. And in those days, Spencer, as you know, I'm sure, that very, very few covers were really shot and planned as covers. They were that were taken, that somebody said, oh, this would make a cover, put this on the cover, or give it to a designer like yourself and say, put some type on this, and make this into a cover. So I realized that I'd already discovered that. And I tried to make as many of my compositions lend themselves to album cover requirements, because that's what I wanted more than anything else. Is I wanted my work to be on covers. I'd started shooting covers as early as '63, and so that's what I was trying to get. This particular composition lent itself to being a cover, and I shot that, and Andrew Oldham loved it and chose to put it on that album.
And something, I'm very strong on typography. I have a very strong typography background. I love the typography on that, because where the typography is placed is in the lower left, and it lets the whole photograph be its own maker. There's no infringement of the photograph at all. You know what I mean? I love that. It was like the type was meant to go there, and the picture was meant to go there. You know what I mean?
Well, Andrew Loog Oldham had a fantastic visual sense.
Mm.
I mean, he's a great man, Andrew. He's still a dear friend of mine, and he was an inspiration to work with. I loved working with him, and I've said this before, and for me, the 60s was Andrew Loog Oldham and everything that he worked with, the Stones and Immediate Records and many other things. But he had a great graphic eye, and he controlled the look of the Stones in that mid-60s period, and album sleeves, it was always his ideas. Put the type here, or do this or do that. So he was a great visualizer.
Yeah, I love the type the type that was used. It has like a metal feel to it a little bit. It got a little clunky. I love that look. Very clean, but it has a sort of a really beautiful look to it. The typography. And I thought that's great because things are ruined by designers who use bad type with great photographs. I've heard this too many times from photographers saying, "Oh, I had this beautiful photograph and the type is terrible on it." You know what I mean? It's like, it's great with you as a photographer. You're working with somebody with a vision and can make it a great design form. That's ultimate. And Judith and I try to be that way with our own life. If you can do that, you're very lucky.
Yes, thank you. Yes, well, I think you're absolutely right, and I love typography too. I'm not against typography, and I'm commercial enough to understand that an album cover has got to be more than just. But I mean, if we could move forward to Between the Buttons, which is the album sleeve that you were about to talk about before.
Yeah.
Between the Buttons, the type on that, the typography on that is invisible.
Right.
I mean, you can hardly see it. It's actually in the buttons of Charlie's jacket.
Yeah. True. So,
yeah.
And that let's go into that shoot that used. I remember talking to you about this the other day, and you mentioned you put Vaseline on the lens, and they were up 6 a.m. And tell us about that shoot. That's a great shoot. I mean, even the outtakes are great. The outtakes are great on that one.
Well, by late '66, I've been working with the band regularly. I felt totally comfortable and at ease with them. It was a marvelous relationship. I felt that they were all friends of mine. I was getting closer with Andrew and working on other projects with him. And I was in the recording studio. They were making that album at Olympic Studios in Barnes in London. And I was beginning to experiment with a filter then, because one of the problems of shooting a band in a recording studio is there's an awful lot of peripheral stuff, which can be very intrusive, lots of vertical and horizontal lines that can be very intrusive. And I wanted to try and find a way of isolating the individuals, because it's very rare in the recording studio that you get a chance to photograph the whole band in a single shot. So my focus was always trying to get great individual photographs of them. And I came up with this idea of creating a sort of vignette out of black card and then rubbing Vaseline on the outside edge of that on a piece of glass, I add, not on directly on the lens. Don't do this at home, folks. Just put a piece of glass in front of your lens and put the Vaseline on that. And I found that worked really well, because the background then sort of disappeared and you just basically saw the person. And I adapted that for the cover shoot. Right. And the cover shoot came about because the Stones, in those days, the Stones would record through the night. They'd start at about 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock in the evening, and they'd record through the night until 5, 6, 7, whenever. And one early morning, we tumbled out of the studio onto the pavement outside, onto the sidewalk outside. And I was looking at the band as they were waiting for their cars to arrive. And I just thought that they looked absolutely fantastic. They looked worn out. They looked hungover. They looked stoned. They looked exhausted.
Right.
They looked exactly like the Rolling Stones should look. And I said, to Andrew and the rest of them, I said, why don't we try and do a session after, early in the morning? And they all agreed. And so we decided the next night or 2 nights, whenever it was, and I decided to take them up to a place called Primrose Hill, which is in North London. And it's a very high point. It's one of the highest points in London. And I thought I'd have a good chance of getting the early morning light. And I'd adapted this filter that I was talking about. And we went there and we got there. I don't know what time it was. I think it was probably about 7-ish. And the light was just beginning to break through. And I started to shoot. And we probably had about 40 minutes before they were just so tired and so cold and so miserable and pissed off with me that basically they stopped working. But in those 40 minutes, we got some fantastic material.
Oh, the outtakes are as good as the cover. I mean, I love the outtakes. It's almost like I would love to see the outtakes on the back cover, maybe, But there's a shot of Brian Jones. He's smiling. He looks like he's stoned out smiling in the photograph, Gered,
Yeah, well, the thing is, Brian was actually being quite tricky at this point. But by the end of '66, Brian was beginning to, how can I put this? He was beginning to show indications that he was becoming increasingly unreliable. And he was being quite tricky on this particular shoot. He bought a newspaper on the way over, and he was reading the newspaper, and he had a big collar on his jacket that he was sort of hiding behind. I turned to Andrew and I said, Andrew, I'm worried that Brian is messing up this shoot. And Andrew was absolutely brilliant, because he said, don't worry about what Brian's doing. It doesn't matter. He can do anything he likes, and it will only enhance the look of the Rolling Stones.
Wow. That's true. That's absolutely true.
It was true, but what it did was it released me from my concerns and my anxiety. And I just let Brian do whatever he wanted. And I just sort of made sure I could see him within the compositions. But if he wanted to turn away, or if he wanted to hide, or if he wanted to turn his back to me, it wouldn't. I was now free to shoot because of Andrew's.
Oh, that's great.
Very astute observation.
Yeah, and the last part, I think we're running into good time here, is you did a shoot of Marianne Faithfull in a recording session at Decca Studio, February '67. And what's interesting is McCartney's in there. Oh, yeah. Explain about McCartney's relationship.
Well, I'd known. Firstly, let me quickly set the scene. This is a recording session where Mick Jagger is producing some tracks with Marianne. And this is 1967. And one of the tracks that I think she's trying to do is the Beatles with a little help from my friends. And Paul McCartney has dropped into the studio as a friend, as a colleague, to be supportive and to offer advice and friendship and maybe some hand claps if they were needed. But Paul, I'd known Paul for a couple of years. I wouldn't want to say I was a bosom buddy of his, but we were friends. We bumped into each other. He was always extremely nice, extremely friendly. So he was perfectly comfortable with me being around. I was there primarily to try and capture the relationship between Mick and Marianne, which was very touching, very sweet that point.
Mm-hmm.
But Marianne was quite fragile now by this moment. And Mick was being extremely affectionate and supportive. And as I say, Paul was there to help boost Marianne, to try and encourage Marianne.
Well, could you pick up the relationship between the Beatles and the Stones at that time?
Well, they were friends. I mean, they were very supportive of each other, really. I mean, there was obviously, it was convenient to generate in the media the sort of mythology that there was great rivalry and great competition. But actually, they were good friends. And, they were worked with each other, supported each other, helped each other, made sure that singles were released in such a way that they didn't fight each other.
Oh, really? Wow.
There was a lot of cooperation. And I always felt that, they were good friends and colleagues, and it liked each other's work and was encouraging of it. I mean, I think there was a competition, there was a competitiveness, but it wasn't aggressive.
Right.
It wasn't a big rivalry. It was, I think they inspired each other. I think that it was, they were all trying to achieve greater things in their own ways. And, it is pretty extraordinary to think that at 80, Paul McCartney is still doing 3-hour shows, and that, Mick's only a couple of years behind him.
Right.
These guys are still working.
It's amazing. It's amazing.
It is absolutely amazing. And there's something, you have to be a really special person, not just an extraordinary talent, but you have to be a really special person to keep a career going that long. It's absolutely.
And not only that, but I was thinking one day, I was talking to somebody about it, and I was saying, think about all the generations that the Rolling Stones are still working. They're still active. They've changed some members, but there's still the Rolling Stones. The guts of it is still there, and no other group has that for so many generations, right, Gerard?
I don't think there's anybody else who has it, and I don't think there's any band. I can't imagine that there's a contemporary band who's going to go on for 50 years. I just don't think it can happen.
No, and even the Beatles don't even come close. You know what I mean? It's like, right? I mean,
no, the Beatles burnt out, didn't they? Yeah. I mean, the Beatles burnt out very quickly, and really, relatively speaking, I mean, the fact that McCartney went on to create Wings, who were huge.
You're right.
And then this extraordinary solo career that goes on and on and on. I mean, he just blew them away at Glastonbury this year, with a phenomenal set that satisfied everybody. And I haven't seen the Stones' current tour, but I hear that the Stones' current tour is quite phenomenal.
I mean, they had a tour several years ago with Mick Taylor showed up, and I thought that was amazing. I did Mick's solo album, actually designed Mick's solo, but Mick is amazing guitarist. The Exile on Main Street album. Wow, Gerard. But I wanted to also say, I want to thank you very much for coming on our show. You're very historic and one of my favorite rock photographers of my life. And it was so wonderful to have you on. And you have other books, I know. Also, besides what we've seen already, there's several books that I sort of loaded up, which Patrick will put into our interview. Other books, pictures of them, covers.
Great. Well, that's good. I have done a lot of books, so that would be great. Yes, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, Spencer. Lovely talking to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Gerard. A real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.